Settle down, children, settle down. I thought you might say that, so I've brought a little surprise for you. Try not to get too excited. I know. Sometimes I impress even myself. Slow down there. Let's think about this for a moment. What would happen to your beloved mortal followers if I was to kill death itself, I wonder?
As I fall into the dark, I dream. I dream of silence and the deep, soft earth. I dream of death and the dog-headed man. The dog-headed man nods once, melting away into the black. I dream of the horned god who slumbers in the deep. As he sleeps, his voice echoes in my mind. He calls my name, an old form, long unspoken, Cres. Awakening was like falling, and in my mind, I screamed. When I awoke, I found myself changed. Blood is sap, sinew is vine, muscle is ceramic. The old memories yet linger, but they are as windows into another life. I must record them while I remember. I know that once I would have felt anger and disgust to see myself like this. But to feel those things, one needs blood, flesh, a human heart. As it is, I feel no rage, no pain, just that I am home. There are others like me here, but they do not move or think as I do. The horned god whispers that I am different, that he brought me here for a reason, and gave me this body of wood and clay. In my silent brothers lies potential, as it does in all things. Everything I need is here, in the earth. 3 of them now live, in their way, and can follow simple commands. The awakening process is slow, but time is not something I lack. As I work, I feel warmth, purpose. The horn god tells me that this is Gielinor. I am of the earth, and her spirit suffuses and sustains me. As she nurtures and tends, so do I. As she hurts, so do I. As she loves, so do I. I must care for my brothers, and for all of Gielinor's creatures. I am their guardian. The egg was brought to me by Fiara. As I slept, Guthix told me of the serpent child within and the role she must play. My brothers and I will tend and warm her, and I will teach her, help her to grow and serve as a fellow guardian. Gielinor is in pain. War rages on her surface, and Juna feels it too. This cannot continue. The world will be broken. My brothers are now many, and over the years I have grown and nurtured them to be strong. In my dreams, Guthix tells me that we should prepare for war, that, if needed, he will return. An exact reckoning on those who would bend this world to their will. Should that time come, we Guardians stand ready.
The Automatons are the guardians of Guthix's final resting place, with Cres as their overseer. He was originally a human known as Ipcress, but was given his current form and name by Guthix after his initial death, and was summoned to build Guthix chambers at the end of the God Wars, where he has resided inside for centuries. Let's take a look deeper into the life of Cres. Due to the masterful skills of Reldo and other researchers, they were able to decipher an ancient text. In the article, Roots in the Community, Reldo gives a brief overview. It reads,
"This is my latest transliteration, gleaned from scraps of yellowed papyrus and rough etchings on ceramic tablets found in the ruins northwest Fardor. They were written in Old Pharynthrian and, although our understanding of the language's dialectic idiosyncrasies is still limited, I believe I've conveyed its sense, as well as my poor pen will permit. Interestingly, despite its third-person perspective, the subjectively phrased descriptions lead me to believe that this story, the source documents date from the Second Age, is autobiographical. This warrants further research.
When the Dark Imperator stopped his advances across Gilinor's scarred surfaces and withdrew to obscurity, becoming the Empty Lord, everything changed. It was here, along the Forentrian border, where the patrols and supply caravans of the Zorosian Empire began to expire. Once rustic hamlets and innocent little villages, previously swallowed by the Great War Machine, slowly started seeing their commanding officers withdraw. Garrisons shut down, and mage architects brought in to build watchtowers, boarded checkpoints, and telepathy relays. The war was over, and towns such as these were its final casualties. Here we find Ipcress, master blacksmith and avid gardener. In Roots of the Community, Reldo continues.
In just such a town, on a hot summer day, a ramshackle dwelling nestled between a grain silo and the quartermaster's, backing out onto an abandoned allotment of cracked earth, a crudely paved yard filled with stacks of scrap metal, and a small forge. Within, Ipcress grumbled as he thrust the broom handle at the panel in the ceiling. He'd been at it for half an hour, sweat pouring and arms aching, but he had succeeded only in denting the brass plate and loosening one of the rivets. He'd known it wouldn't be an easy job. He'd secured the plate himself, and the metal had expanded in the hot sun. But knowing made it no less frustrating. He stopped for a moment, breathing heavily, sweeping lank strands of hair back over his balding head. Coughing from the dust and the dry afternoon heat, Ipcress appraised the panel once more. Perhaps he could strike it from a different angle. Or maybe just imagine it to be Mage Commander Sequitus's face. He grinned and attacked the roof with renewed vigor. The plate finally yielded with a clang, a clatter, and a burst of afternoon sunlight. Ipcress let the broom handle fall to the ground and hung his head forward, panting, with his hands on the aching small of his back. After a moment, he looked over at the small ceramic pot by the window, with the mournfully drooping olive plant protruding from the parched earth packed within it, and growled. Remembering the ire that had driven him just a few moments before, he wrenched his old wooden ladder out from underneath a pile of empty paint-mixing tins, thrust it into place, snatched the plant pot up under his left arm, and pulled himself up into the light. Squinting as he adjusted to the glare of the high sun, he surveyed the area for the culprit. Shielding his eyes with his hand, he turned his gaze south, looking up and sneered in derision. They'd started building that great bloody scrying tower a couple of months back, but of course that hadn't been good enough. They'd kept building and building, minarets, belvederes, fancy magical pylons, all with unnatural speed. And the dark crystals at the tower's peaks twisted light and blocked the sun. The only things left for the plants on his south-facing window wedge were dust and late summer dry heat. They might just survive the next few months, but with autumn on the way and then winter, those towers and the lifeless soil would be the death of his plants. The roof wasn't his choice in location, but it got enough sun for most of the day, and the Imperial Army had claimed the land he might otherwise have built on, or used as an allotment. Now, though, came the hard part. Ipcress looked down into the yard to the rear of his shack. Yesterday, he dragged the first 2 glass panes in the metal frame across from his forge, strapped them onto a wooden pallet, and thrown the weighted end of the long leather strap attached to it up onto the roof. It was simply a case of fixing that strap to the ratcheted pulley attachment, still here from when he built the place, and hauling the parts up, but he was already tired. The afternoon was hot, and his muscles ached grievously. He looked again at his plant pot, and gritted his teeth, bent at the knees, and gripped the strap with both hands.
As Ipcress continued struggling solo to assemble this greenhouse he was trying to put up, a young child came through his property looking for his services. The young boy introduced himself as Harold, a disguise by death, who sought him out to complete a special task. He would help him finish construction on the greenhouse in exchange for repairing the blade for his scythe. The text continues.
A passable smith, that's right enough. That lot keep me pretty busy, though. Ipcress thumbed towards the old town hall to the northwest, now serving as the mage commander's administrative center. Harold had hefted the iron struts from the pallet up onto his left shoulder and was reaching down to pick up one of the larger glass panes with his right hand. The empty lord provides for those who serve, eh? He deposited the panes and then stamped his boot on the roof of Ipcress's shack, the edge of his mouth hinting at a smirk. Well, he provides something, at least. Is, all of this yours? Ipcress bristled. This is my home, all right? Mine. I've been here longer than this rabble. Longer than you've drawn breath, most likely. All the others left when the army rolled up and started throwing their weight around. But I wasn't going anywhere. So long as I fulfill their commissions, they leave me well enough alone. And they bring me plenty of scrap to work and trade with. Harold grinned. Well now, it sounds like you might be able to help me out. He fumbled in his satchel before producing a small rusted piece of metal, holding it out for Ipcress to see. Ipcress frowned, peering closer at the object. It was a few inches long, curved and tapered to a point, sharpened along its inside edge, blunt, and covered in rust and grime. Most likely an agricultural implement of some kind, and a poorly maintained one at that. Ipcress's nostrils flared with distaste. What am I supposed to do with this? He grumbled. Simple matter, really, said Harold. I'd like it cleaned and wetted, if you'd be so kind. That all? Can mend that yourself? Ipcress didn't take his eyes off the shard of metal, and took a rag from his belt. He spat on it and rubbed vigorously at the blade's surface. The afternoon sun reflected from the speck of its revealed surface, which was resplendent with smooth, waving lines, and he stopped to stare. Harold grinned again broadly. Ipcress growled from the back of his throat, holding it up for closer inspection. Notice the work you've been doing in your backyard. If I may say, it's a rare day that you find someone able to work that sort of metal. Harold tilted his head, attempting to catch Ipcress's eye. The older man was hunched over the metal, eyes fixed. He's right and all, thought Ipcress. Where'd a milksop farm boy like him get steel like this? Looks like it's from the hand of a Menophyte bladesmith. Ipcress was familiar with such techniques. During his mandatory years of Imperial service, he'd been on a campaign far to the south. He'd had a chance to see Menophyte patterned steel firsthand. He'd since derived from it a similar technique of his own, the reuse of scrap metal, and, yes, it was what he'd been using for the commissions given to him of late by the Imperial Army. The boy must have been nosing around before he made his approach. This blade was different, though. The wave-like pattern suggested similar strength-giving impurities in the folded metal, but this was different to either method that Ipcress had seen. Cold to the touch, despite the heat of the day, and an odd hue. Was the fact that this seemed to be a farming tool of some kind. Why would such an exotic metal they used for something so mundane. Something about the whole situation felt off, and Ipcress, fascinated as he was, wasn't sure he was comfortable with it. "So, Uncle, think you can help me?" Ipcress started, and his eyes flicked to Harold. "Sorry, lad," he said. "There's an interesting piece for sure, but I don't have the time. As you say, I've commitments to the Mage Commander. There's this project, too." He gestured to the panels and framework that Harold had deposited on the roof of his home. Harold tutted. "Oh, they must be working you ragged if you've no time for such a small task. Come now, no need to be modest. It looks like the empty lords got plenty out of you for the time being, and I know you've the skill to do the task I'm asking for. Do you? I'm a fair hand with manual stuff like this, as you've seen. How about I help you out with your glass house here, and you can use the free time to sort out my blade? Perhaps even put your feet up and enjoy the sun, if you're done nice and quick."
For whatever reason, no matter how hard he tried, Ipcress could not polish the steel that Death had commissioned for him. All of his techniques, tips and tricks, learned over his many years of making weaponry for the Imperial Army, could not have prepared him for this metal. Meanwhile, Death completed his bargain, cleaning his hands of any leftover agreements they had. It was all on Ipcress now. In Roots of the Community, we see his struggles. It reads,
Ipcress had cleared a space among the mess of components, half-finished inventions, and papers that littered his workspace. He'd spent a good while puzzling over the reasons for making an agricultural tool with such esoteric methods, when even the Imperial Army were equipped with bronze and iron. Now he had more pressing concerns. He'd always had a knack for craftsmanship. Wood, stone, and particularly metal were old friends to him, and he'd always had a way of coaxing and guiding them to the shapes and purposes he wanted in a way that felt natural. None of the magical nonsense that had become endemic throughout the Empire in recent times. "I have everything you need's right there in the steel," Ipcress often boasted after a pint or two. His brow furrowed yet further. "Where's what I need now?" It was already late morning, and none of Ipcress's attempts had yielded success. Though he'd cleaned it quickly enough, although he hadn't been able to attain the sheen he usually took such pride in. The blade seemed old, practically an antique, and every time he turned it over, after finishing one side, he would swear that it had a fleck of rust or ground-in piece of grit that wasn't there before. He spent some time at it, with an abrasive pad of compacted iron wire, and then a file, but soon found that he was perspiring with the effort, and the edge hadn't re-emerged to his satisfaction. He shook his head and cursed, and took out his oil and whetstone, securing the metal in a vise and grinding away from himself along the edge. After a prolonged period of work, Ipcress touched a calloused finger to the edge. Nothing. He was becoming irritated. Was the lad playing a prank on him? He spat on the ground and began to rummage among the detritus of his work. He found it under a collapsed pile of schematic and notes, and pulled a muscle in his back as he dragged it out onto the workshop floor. Cursing and rubbing his aching back, he surveyed it. The wooden frame was covered with cobwebs, but a rough shake confirmed that it was still solid. An insect of some kind had made a nest for its young within the seat's padding, leaving the hollow filled with shed pupae that Ipcress brushed clean. Crucially, the pedal-driven mechanism at the frame's base still spanned when worked, and the great round stone remained seated on its axle, the leather strap linking the two still intact. He designed it for battle-axe blades and the two-ended iron swords used by the Empire's myrmidons, but the Imperial Army's widespread use of weapon enchantments meant that even the lowliest bronze short sword retained its point and its edge nigh indefinite, and there'd been no call for such a solution. Ipcress felt faintly ridiculous as he sat down and held the small blade against the large helming stone. but he flipped the small lever at the bottom to engage the axle of the pedal mechanism and got to work. The mechanism groaned with the first few turns, but Ipcress soon got it turning with a steady rhythm and began to work the edge. The stone on the blade's edge made a high screeching sound, and sparks flew from it as Ipcress increased the speed of the wheel. Sometime later, when his legs ached and the pain in his back became too much to ignore, Ipcress took the blade from the wheel and allowed it to come to a halt. The fingers of his leather gloves were wearing where he caught them on the wheel's rough, spinning surface, but he could already tell that his efforts had been in vain. He removed one glove and held the blade, still cool, its waved surface shimmering eerily in the failing light. He sighed and, through force of habit, ran his finger along the blunt edge. He was slumped in the worn chair in his living area, a despondent grimace across his face, when he noticed the silence. Since the land on which his home stood had been commandeered by the army, silence had been a rare commodity. There was always something coming or going, drills being conducted, or strange claps, hisses, and uncanny whispers in the night from whatever foolish rituals they conducted in the towers. Then he remembered Harold, and realized that he had not heard the sounds of work from above for some time. He stood up and headed towards the ladder. The boy was likely taking the time out to sun his milky hide rather than doing some work. Then Ipcress was becoming aware that it was unlikely he'd be able to fulfill his part of the bargain either. As Ipcress pulled himself over the edge of the hatch and into the dusk light, his mouth, ready to lambast Harold for his sloth, fell open, and the silence remained unbroken. Amid the shadows cast by the low sun from the great scaffolds and constructions of the military base were rays of golden sunlight, crisscrossing the roof of his small shack and glinting from the panes of the glass dome that stood before him, perfectly built and just as he had envisioned it.
As Ipcress stood in the completed greenhouse, basking in the waning light, he could not find Harold. He was nowhere to be found. But regardless, one day he will pay him back for his kindness. That happiness, though, in that moment, a feeling of tranquility washed over him. He was incredibly grateful. Unfortunately, Ipcress would not be able to bask for long, though. This is RuneScape after all. The text continues.
It was a muggy autumn morning when they came. Ipcress was by his small stove, rolling his neck from side to side to work out the pricks of the night in his hammock, enjoying the kick of fresh chili and Haralander that masked the less than fresh odor of the eggs he was scrambling. He heard a rattling sound and looked up to see the pans and utensils hanging above the hall, vibrating. Good timing, he thought. The month's consignment was early by several days, and he was running low on supplies. Even civilians were required to be present for the changing of the guard, so he knew he'd have to hurry. He scarfed his eggs and drank half his too-hot herbal tea, pulled on his jacket and made for the door, a wedge of toasted bread clamped in his mouth. The central track of the base was lined with people, civilian staff and soldiers alike. Ipcress wondered why they weren't assembling in the mustering yard as they usually did, and noted the hushed whispers and furrowed brows all around. No one had been expecting an arrival today, it seemed, and certainly not one of this size. Ipcress craned his neck to see between the heads of two of the soldiers, and saw the first of the approaching column. They were light horse, equipped to serve as skirmishers or outriders, each rider clad in a light cuirass, deep purple tunic, and the customary closed-face helm of the Imperial Army's elite. They were each armed with a short spear, a light bow, and a curved bronze dagger. The horses cantered at a steady pace, unperturbed by the surrounding clamor, and the warriors rode with their heads slightly bowed. Next came foot. First spears, each man's shield and right arm shoulder guard designed to fit with those of the one next to him as they closed ranks into a phalanx. Myrmidons, with their blades of ensorcelled iron, and a contingent of sappers and engineers, each man laden with a heavy pack, which Ipcress knew contained tools and magical explosives. Looks like they're preparing for a siege, rather than a pitched battle, thought Ipcress. We've did nothing like this for months. Plus, where's the baggage train? Usually, such a force in friendly territory would send wagons ahead to prepare for the arrival of the troops, but Ipcress had seen no such thing. Then, archers, great yew bows strapped to their backs. They were the only soldiers with their faces exposed, grim mouths and set jaws jutting from the shadows cast by their wide-brimmed wicker hats. Then finally, the detachment's few heavy horse, the commanding officer's personal guard. Great black destriers snorted and champed beneath burnished bronze barding, and blackened iron sabers hung at each rider's side. They wore long coats of dark iron mail, over which were layered violet surcoats, with the Empire's cross and circle insignia, and each rider had a mask with a different copper face. In their midst walked a figure a head taller again than his mounted guard. His long strides easily kept pace with the brisk trot of the horsemen, his black robe rippling in the breeze, and his iron-bound boots grinding the earth with each great step. Small, piercing eyes shone from beneath his black cowl, and ridges of gray, horn-like tissue on his face lent him a permanent, imperious sneer. Slung in a scabbard at his back was a heavy greatsword, and he carried a staff of twisted black wood, topped with a spherical object whose pale green surface skirled and wheeled. Just looking at it made Ipcress's eyes water, scents of sulfur and mustard erupting unbidden in his nostrils. A Mashawat, one of the Empty Lord's pet sorcerers. Ipcress had never seen one before, and as he passed, the air grew cold, and a shiver ran through Ipcress. Whispers of a name rippled through the crowd. Zemorigal.
Ipcress heard the rumors that Zemorigal was a turncoat, one of the surviving stern judges of the Menophites, who had defected to the Imperial Army when the desert god Tumekin had died in a great explosion of fire, laying ruin to invaders and defenders alike and rendering the Caridian province an arid wasteland. He was a necromancer, it was said, a ruthless legatist willing to resort to even the blackest magic to achieve victory. Zemorigal stood at a podium addressing the crowd as he announced in the name of the Empty Lord that they would lay siege to Menaphos. As the news washed over the onlookers, they realized why his words had weight. Reldo continues.
But the surly noises of discontent from the crowd were turning to gasps of horror, the cries growing as more of the assembled civilians turned to see what was coming down the road to the mustering yard. Ipcress had previously tuned out the low rumbling in the distance as the coming baggage train, but now it had grown and sounded like nothing he had heard before. It rumbled up through Ipcress's body as slow, thunderous booms. Zemorigal tapped his staff on the ground once, twice, echoing sonorously, and beckoned with his free hand. Eyes wide, Ipcress followed the gaze of the crowd. The thing that lumbered along the base's dusty track was 30 feet tall at least, and roughly humanoid in shape. But that was where all semblance of decency and respect for life ended. Its surface was a pallid mass of flesh, twisted into shape with what Ipcress could only assume was the blackest of sorcery. It was flanked by 2 hooded figures, swinging copper censers on chains, priests of the somber vigil, a prominent death cult in the capital. Sweet-scented smoke purified the air and protected those nearby from disease, Ipcress speculated, but it could not mask cloying stench of decay from the abomination that approached. Zamoragul was explaining the construct's purpose, but Ipcress saw all too clearly. The dead that inevitably accrue over the long journey south were to be melded into flesh giants such as this one, and by the time they arrive, wait for it, free, independently mobile siege engines, needing no food or manpower to maintain, and only getting bigger as the light force of reavers ravaged the settlements scattered on the way. Once away from the censers of the death priests, it would spread disease as well. Objectively, ruthlessly efficient, it was this that the Empire was built on, and the relative peace and prosperity at home made it all too easy to forget. Cres had tried to deny it, but he was as complicit as anyone. As he looked around at the silent crowd, ashen-faced and staring at their feet, he shook with anger and shame. As the monster approached, he was grimacing with disgust at the twisted surface of the thing, in which he was certain he could still make out fingers, knees, and other recognizably human parts, when something glinted. Ipcress squinted and covered his eyes from the sun's glare, and, suddenly, exhaled hoarsely. He dropped, quaking to one knee, clutching his cramping stomach and covering his mouth. Someone was kneeling next to him, a hand on his shoulder, calling his name, but the voice sounded so far away. As the flesh construct passed and made its way to the courtyard where it would rest, Cres knew that within it was a strong steel frame made from salvaged scrap metal with a waved, patterned surface. My steel. They used my steel. The morning light burst into Ipcress's eyes as he pushed to the front of the crowd and staggered into the courtyard. Hundreds of eyes bored into him as he advanced, and he could see soldiers mouthing angry words, their hands at their weapons. Ipcress became aware that, cold, in his outstretched hand, was Harold's blade, and that he too was shouting, brandishing the blade in front. "I'll kill you for this! I'll kill you!"
Ipcress felt an impact as he staggered backwards. He looked down to see an arrow in his chest and blood on his hands. He collapsed. In the commotion, in only a few short strides, Zamoragul was already standing over him, preparing to perform an execution, as a green mist filled around his staff, and he began pulling strands from its core. As he was about to strike, Harold's voice rang out from the fray, flanking and circling his way around Zamoragul to where the blade lay. Zamoragul's demeanor cracked. In a flash, the world was dark and very cold, the crowd no longer visible or heard. Zamoragul stood where he had been, frozen to the spot, as the young boy, Harold, had transformed himself into a grim figure, clad in black robes that seemed almost part of the shadow. As if time slowed, death was instantly in front of that monstrous construct, striking it down. Next, he was by Zamoragul, slashing his staff in half, and then quickly moved to Ipcress. Color bled back into the world. Zamoragul cursed in defeat, and he barked evacuation orders to his soldiers. Death was by his side now, a warm smile crossing his face, reassuring Ipcress everything will be alright as the edges of his vision faded to black. Cres eventually awoke with his body changed into one similar to a tree, and began to hear whispers from the sleeping Guthix, who informed him that he had brought him there and gave him his current form, and that he had recognized his intelligence and granted him even greater mental capacity. He awoke alongside others like him, who did not move or think, and eventually proceeded to program his silent brothers to perform simple commands. As he worked on his brothers, Guthix eventually gave him more information on his purpose, and he came to see himself as a guardian of his brothers and all of Gilinor's creatures. At some point, he was visited by Fiara, who gave him an egg. Guthix then told him via his dreams that it contained a serpent child, with a role to play. Cres and his automatons proceeded to care for the serpent within the egg, who became known as Juna, and taught her to grow and become a guardian alongside him. As the God Wars reached their height, he and Juna began to notice the destruction caused by the God Wars on the surface. Via his dreams, Guthix told Cres to prepare for war, and that if need be, he would awaken and exact reckoning on the young gods, but that he would need his guardians to protect him. When Zamorak used the Stone of Jas to destroy Forinthi, this time finally came. After Guthix awakened from his slumber, he tasked Cres and the other guardians with protecting him while he created the Edicts of Guthix and cast the gods out of Gilinor. After Guthix finished creating the edicts and banishing the gods, he chose Cres to build and guard his resting place. Cres started by building a cocoon of barriers around Guthix, which easily repelled the few people who attempted to break in. Eventually, people stopped coming, although Cres continued to expand Guthix's resting place, causing it to reach its current size. Cres passed the time by creating technology, such as more automatons and the Cresbots, which he created to be his companions. The time spent guarding Guthix changed Cres. With only his creations to keep him company, his isolation caused him to become much less lively, to the degree that he forgot his own name. Cres is encountered by the adventurer within the temple during the World Wakes, after they discover the Guardians of Guthix. Juna recognizes him as an old ally of some of Guthix's guardians from before the God Wars and the fall of the gods. Cres directs the adventurer to examine a nearby shrine, which asks them to make a judgment in several scenarios. Upon doing so, the adventurer becomes blessed by Guthix. Shortly after this happens, it becomes apparent that the Guardians need to go to battle. Cres and his automatons go to battle against Zamoragul and his undead minions, as he and the automatons keep most of them off the World Guardian. After driving Zamoragul off, Cres and his automatons are soon recalled to the main room to defend against the Sardamist assault. In the chaos of the ensuing battle, Commander Ziliana makes her way to Cres, fatally stabbing him in the mistaken belief he was Guthix, but he simply laughs it off and calls her a fool as he dies. As a result of his death, the automatons could no longer be maintained, Those that remained in Guthix cave became aggressive towards anyone who entered. That was the history of Cres and the Automatons. If you enjoyed the content, please like and subscribe, and wait for our next episode in the lore of various Slayer creatures within RuneScape. I'd like to give a big shout out to KJ234 for voicing Cres in the epilogue at the beginning of the video, and also Lorecat for voicing Reldo in the Roots from the Community article. RuneScape forever.